Growing up in the India of the 90s, would never have thought that one day we'd be sitting here, all of us, when in a week when there are 2 elections taking place, and we'll go away thinking that the Bihar elections are less controversial than the US election. So firstly, Ambassador, is that surprising? And I'm sure when Vivek in Saloni penciled in this date, 6th of November, in the Quorum schedule, they thought that by now it'll be easy to have, the 5th, we'd know by now who the next president of the United States is going to be. So first and foremost, your thoughts and how do we get here?
Well, I think, you are absolutely right. I don't think anybody ever assumed that the Bihar election would be kind of swept out. Not just that, even Arnab Goswami's being taken into custody would just be swept away from media and attention and things like that. And people would be just focused on the US election. But then, I guess, this is an election, this is a US election like no other US election. I mean, we have had US elections where we've had one-term presidents. Doesn't happen very often. It has only happened about 4 times in the last 120 years. So it's as rare as that. I mean, that is the power of incumbency, in case you kind of figure. And, but nonetheless, even from that point of view, every time that we have had an incumbent president being denied a second term, it is normally in a very decisive fashion. It kind of happens that there is a strong wave against it, and the challenger comes in and gets a massive majority. Now, we know one thing for sure. I mean, we don't know whether Trump will win or Biden will win. But we know one thing, that even if Biden wins, it's not going to be with a massive majority. I mean, so from that point of view, it is an unusual election. And in so many other ways as well, it is an election which is creating, I guess, a new kind of history, as it were, both for the US, and I think there are also perhaps some lessons somewhere for other democracies and their elections as well.
So you say the power of incumbency. You've touched upon this. The fact is we don't know who's going to win, no matter what happens in 2020. The reality is, and I think this is something we all need to acknowledge, that Donald Trump has already polled more voters than he has in 2016, correct? Biden's lead over Trump isn't as large as you mentioned, as pollsters expected. This blue wave that was predicted hasn't emerged, and the Democrats have done much worse than they thought in the House of Representatives, in the House and the Senate. So the people of America have not had buyer's remorse per se after 4 years of Trump in the White House. Is that
correct? Absolutely. There is no buyer's remorse. I mean, if you look at it, in 2016, Trump had 63 million votes. He's already polled something like 68 million. And as the count continues, I mean, his numbers may become higher still. Secondly, if there was a blue wave, there was a certain feeling that there were at least half a dozen Senate seats, because the Senate, which is extremely powerful, was 47-53, 47 Democrats and 53 Republicans. So there was a feeling that at least there were about half a dozen seats that were in play, where possibilities of changes were likely. I think we've seen that the Democrats have gained 2 seats and they've lost 1. How far? So that takes them to 48. But whether they will manage to even cross 50 or even touch 50 is an open question. Chances are they won't. So And as far as the Congress is concerned, the House of Representatives, there in the outgoing House, you had a difference of about 40 seats, 232 Democrats and 197 Republicans. And it is quite clear that while the Democrats will retain an edge over the Republicans, but nonetheless, the numbers, their margin is going to shrink, maybe by 10, maybe by 15, who knows. So in a sense, you're very right. There is no blue wave. And so that is also one of the unusual things, because in the past, when you had a one-term presidency, you have, as I said, the incumbent, when he's been denied, and it has always been a he, as you all know. When the incumbent has been denied his second term, it has been denied very decisively. And secondly, it has often been accompanied by actually a profound political shift, in the sense that, Congress has shifted. And that shift has lasted for quite long. I mean, take, for example, Jimmy Carter. In 1980, Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan, right? And Jimmy Carter, Democrat, Ronald Reagan, Republican. It was accompanied by the Republican Revolution, which then came into the Congress and the Senate, and the Republicans then continued to hold these houses, continued to control Congress for a long, long, long time. Or take, for example, 1932, when FDR, Roosevelt, came to power, and he defeated Hoover. And it was accompanied by an enormous democratic shift in Congress, which lasted for years, which brought in the New Deal, Social Security, saw through the World War II, brought in the entire growth of the middle class in the United States, the development of Social Security, and a whole host of things like that. So normally, it's been accompanied by these power shifts. Now, it's very interesting that just about 2 weeks ago, there were people writing, political commentators, American political commentators, they were writing about the fact that is there going to be a secret power shift? Is all the polls that were reflecting a Biden victory, are they hiding, are they sort of hinting at a wave, as it were? Now, I think one thing that we know, even without knowing the outcome of the election, is that there is no wave. So clearly, there is no power shift that is taking place. I mean, the Congress will remain Democratic. So Nancy Pelosi is likely to remain Speaker, but with lesser majority. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is likely to continue in his position, maybe not with 53 to 47, maybe with 51 to 49 or 52 to 48 or whatever it is. But certainly there is no blue wave, there is no fundamental power shift.
But the fact that the Democrats aren't in majority in the Senate, that's another takeaway from this election that I don't think is emphasized enough, even in India, because the big takeaway is, oh, Biden wins, Biden is the new president, but he's a president in a Senate that the Democrats don't have a majority over, which means they can either be an obstacle for any of Biden policies going forward, or they could have pushed Biden policies forward if they had a majority. And right now it's the reverse, similarly. So Republicans waking up in the US right now have the comfort of that thought.
Sure. But that's not a new phenomenon, because polarization in the US, in a sense, the US has this separation of powers, like most democracies have, between the executive branch, the legislative branch, which is the Congress, the executive branch, which is the presidency. and the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court and the circuit courts and appeal courts and so on. So you have this very clear kind of separation of powers in the US, which is laid down in the Constitution. And in that sense, the idea was that no single branch of government should become dominant. However, there was also another aspect, that namely branches of government should be able to work together. Now, in recent years, and this is not a Trump phenomena, mind you, this existed, I mean, Obama faced the same problem. Obama was president for 2 terms, 8 years. In his in his second term particularly, he was faced with a Republican-controlled Senate, which made it extremely difficult for him to push through any legislation, any legislation. I mean, to give you an example, I'm sure you would have all followed in recent times the nomination of the Supreme Court Justice, Amy Barrett, and the fact how her nomination was put forward, how her approvals, the hearings were conducted. Democrats boycotted the committee hearings, and it was pushed through by the Republicans, and because they had a majority, so they pushed it through and they got her on the bench. And she is now an associate justice of the US Supreme Court. Now, if you remember in Obama's last year, 2016, in February, the election was in November, as is always the case. In February, there was a vacancy on the US Supreme Court. And the Obama administration nominated a judge to join as a member of the Supreme Court. Now, the same Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate Majority Leader, the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, and since it is Republicans have a majority, so we call them the Senate Majority Leader, the same Mitch McConnell said that this being an election year, we should not have a hearing or do a nomination hearing because it has political implications. And so he held it back for 10 months. In this particular case, when he was questioned and people said, well, you held it back at that time. Why the hell are you going ahead with this undue haste? Which was undue. I mean, it has never happened before in the Supreme Court that within a week you have pushed through committee hearings and the Senate approvals. And he said, well, in this particular case, both the President and the Senate are in the hands of the Republicans, so there is no conflict of interest. Oh, that's it. Now, but what I'm trying to explain to all of you is that this is part of the polarization that has now come to stay. And this is just one manifestation. I mean, this nomination to the Supreme Court is just one manifestation. But this polarization did not begin with Trump, nor is it going to end with Trump. This polarization, as you very rightly said, is going to stay. And if Biden wins, then he will certainly have to face this challenge of a polarized America, of a highly polarized, I mean, how does he push through his legislative agenda? Because given the fact that you have a very large number of people who have voted for Trump, it shows that his appeal has not diminished. Had you found actually, and this is an interesting thought to dwell on, had you found that Trump had lost numbers and that people had kind of given him negative marks, or people who had earlier voted for him in 2016 had gotten disenchanted because they felt that this guy had not been very competent and he'd been erratic or he hadn't handled COVID well or whatever it is. And if they had decided that, you know, I can't be seen to be voting for Trump, then you would have seen a diminution, in which case you may have had an interesting situation of a distancing between the Republican Party and Donald Trump. Because remember, Donald Trump was an outsider. I mean, he was not a hardcore Republican Party politician. He was an outsider to politics. He was an outsider to the Republican Party. But it was convenient for the Republican Party to adopt him because it helped the conservative agenda of the Tea Party, which is the more extreme right wing of the Republican Party. It helped them. And in case the Trump vote had actually, instead of moving up from 63 million to 68 million and maybe even higher, as we see the final counts as they emerge, had it actually come down, the Republican Party could perhaps have said, well, he served his purpose. I mean, he helped us get 3 judges, 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court. And as you know, the Supreme Court justice appointments are for lifetime. So, you know, they're going to be there for like decades and decades. So this is a great achievement. And thank you very much, Mr. Trump. Goodbye. You've served your purpose. But that's unlikely to happen. I mean, I don't know. But I think it is unlikely to happen because the Republican Party also sees that Mr. Trump remains a great vote getter. So that polarization that you asked about is something that's here to stay.
But talking about challenges, I do want to bring in the whole how this impacts and affects India. So going by the latest predictions, if Joe Biden is the next president of the United States, what does this mean for our foreign ministry, and do they have a challenge of restoring relations with the Democrats? Because we've seen India informally have a Namaste Trump campaign. We had an unprecedented break from the past, never happened before, where you hear the slogan, Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar, uttered by none other than the Prime Minister himself.
Yeah, but don't forget the same Prime Minister, when he welcomed Obama as the Republic Day chief guest in 2015, also had the famous Chai Pe Charcha with Obama in the lawns of Hyderabad House. So I think here, Prime Minister Modi certainly, he puts a lot of faith in a personal diplomacy, a personalized kind of diplomacy. We've seen that, you know, his dropping in Lahore to wish Nawaz Sharif at that point happy birthday, or his sitting in a jhula with Xi Jinping on the banks of Sabarmati, or sipping coconut water with him on the beaches of Mamlapuram, or whatever it is, or his hugs, his, you know, his frequent hugs, which are a little less now, I think. But yes, but it is quite clear that he sort of lays a lot of stress on a personalized style of diplomacy. However, on a more sort of serious note, if you look at India-US relations, then I think India-US relations, and I've been involved with it for over a decade, in fact, it sort of took a new turn with the end of the Cold War. So let's say if you look at the last 3 decades, there are 3 factors that are driving India-US relations. And first, when the Cold War ended, the wars of ideology ended. Now, the US had always thought that India was a pro-Soviet. I mean, the US saw the world in black and white. USSR, US, you're not with us, you are against us, that kind of ideological thing. Now, ideology went out. So that particular element shifted out of our equation. That was factor number one. And ideology, in a sense, has still not come back. I mean, US-China rivalry is not based on ideology. It may be based on so many other things, but not ideology. China is very much a state capitalist, whatever. Second factor, I think the Indian economy, for its own reasons, and not because of American prodding, but the Indian economy had started opening up because of our own crisis. I think you know as much as I do about it. And that process of liberalization, the opening up of the Indian economy, has continued uninterrupted. I'm not saying that it has continued at the same pace. Sometimes it has moved a little faster. Sometimes it has slowed down a little bit. But the trajectory has been in the same general direction. Depending on how strong the government in Delhi is or whatever. But so sometimes, you carry out more reforms and sometimes you kind of slow down on things like that. But nonetheless, it has continued to open up. So that continued economic opening up, and therefore the interest of corporate America, is something that has continued to interest the US. The third factor is the coming of political age of the Indian diaspora. I very clearly remember when I first started engaging with the US. You see, a large element of the Indian diaspora, which is today about 4 million strong, a large part of the Indian diaspora started going there in the 1960s, 70s, and so on. And these were all professionals, highly qualified, and they wanted to make a mark for themselves. And many of them did, as you know very well. And by about the 1980s, 90s, they had all sort of made their millions. They had all graduated to, many houses and many cars and complete financial security. Their kids had probably flown the coop and they were now all in Harvard or Stanford or wherever else they were studying. And that is when this particular cohort started engaging in US domestic politics. We set up the India Caucus. It was a kind of a friendship group for India in the US House of Representatives. We struggled in 1990s to set it up, and eventually it got set up. And then we wanted to follow through with a similar exercise for the Senate. Now, the Senate actually doesn't, under US laws, you can't call it a caucus. So we decided to call it the Senate Friends of India. This happened in 2004. By the time we set up the Senate Friends of India in 2004, there was no shortage of people wanting to come and co-chair it. Now, for obvious reasons, we wanted to make it bipartisan in the sense that we would have both people from the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. And our first co-chair from the Democratic side was Hillary Clinton, no less. So, so things had changed. From the time in the 1990s when we were struggling to set up the India Caucus in the House, to having a Senate, and today you have a Samosa Caucus, as you know, in the House. So I think things have changed because these three factors, the opening up of the Indian economy, the absence of ideology in major power rivalry, and the growing economic and political engagement of the Indian diaspora. These three factors are the key factors that are driving the India-US relationship.
Irrespective of government.
Irrespective of government to government. Irrespective of government to government. Wait, the government to government surely has a bearing. The Bush administration, along with Dr. Manmohan Singh in Delhi, played a huge role in the nuclear deal. No two ways about it. And it is actually, if you go through the steps that were needed and how it happened, it's like
So did
a
Vajpayee
thriller.
Narasimha Rao.
Sure. The opening started with Narasimha Rao. The first dialogue actually began on non-proliferation under Narasimha Rao. Then we saw ups and downs, and then you saw the nuclear tests, and suddenly the US came down like a ton of bricks on India. I mean, we were the nastiest people, we were the most unreliable people. Clinton took the lead in terms of imposing sanctions on India. He took the lead in international condemnation of India. The US took the lead in the UN Security Council in passing resolutions against India and all the rest of it. And yet the same Clinton, by the time he came in March of 2000 to India, I don't know how many of you remember that visit. I mean, things changed. And so part of it was also due to people involved. And here the dialogue that Jaswant Singh, the late Mr. Jaswant Singh, had with Strobe Talbot, who was his designated interlocutor on the American side, helped enormously. I mean, it was the most intense dialogue that we have had. I mean, they had something like 18 rounds in 24 months, which is insane. I mean, where do you hear of this kind of intensity of dialogue? And but it helped change perceptions, both on our side. Mind you, we also have a lot of bees in our bonnet about the United States and whether it is good to be friends with the US and so on. And, how close should we get to them, and are they to be trusted, and whatever it is. So it's not as if it's an easy relationship. And largely it is because we have always thought of ourselves as, in terms of non-alignment, strategic autonomy, etc., etc. And the US, at least for the last 100 years, has been a major power. And the US has had two kinds of relationships. I mean, one is a relationship of a rival, like US-USSR, or like now, US-China, let's say. So it's like a relationship between two rivals, adversaries, etc. The other is a relationship with your alliance partners. Now, whether it is Japan, whether it is Germany, whether it is Britain, whatever. These guys are junior fellows. I mean, the US is a huge economy. It is the nuclear superpower. It's the technology superpower. Yeah, Germany is it's a big economy. So is Japan. So is South Korea. But nonetheless, these are relatively small fry. So, and I guess these countries know because they are also in military alliances with the US. So in a sense, they are seen as junior partners. So the US is used to having two kinds of relationships, dealing with junior partners or dealing with rivals. I mean, how do you deal with an India which is neither? And how does India deal with the US? I mean, India is not equal to the US, obviously not. I mean, we know that. Neither in economic terms, nor in defense capability, nor in strategic reach or anything like that. But nonetheless, we don't want to be treated as a junior partner because we are not an ally. I mean, you read that all the time. And at the same time, obviously we are not a rival to the US. So we have, both of us have to find ways of working together to find an idiom, to find a vocabulary that enables us to be able to take the relationship forward. But the three factors, underlying factors that I pointed to, I think are the factors that are going to continue to drive the relationship in a positive trajectory.
But as you mentioned, Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy is led by this personality-driven, friendship-driven policy. What does that mean for Joe Biden? Because Joe Biden was one of the strongest critics of Modi at the time of the 2002 riots, right? You talked of the Samosa Caucus. You have, what's his name, Ro Khanna, who's probably going to be the most influential voice in the House. And so many comments. Even Kamala Harris has made such strong comments on Kashmir. Pramila Jayapal,
re-elected.
Re-elected, very strong comments on the situation, the way the government has handled Kashmir. So how does that play out going forward with the government pushing forward on, NRA, on CAA, on 370, Ram Mandir? Because Biden has made it very clear that they value a liberal India, as does Kamala Harris. And Modi's friendship with Trump doesn't seem to have benefited India economy-wise, H-1B visa-wise, buying cheaper oil from Iran or Venezuela, fights with China on the border, but we can't buy weapons from Russia because of the threat of a sanction.
Despite the fact that we have a 4 million strong diaspora, out of which probably about 1.7 or 1.8 million Indians actually vote. Of the 1.8 million members of the diaspora vote in the elections. I mean, we don't determine who the US president is going to be.
Sure.
Right? So, we will take whoever is the US president, whatever the American people decide in terms of who they elect. And we will deal with them just as we dealt with Obama. I mean, if you're talking about Modi. I mean, otherwise, if you look back, as I said, there has been this bipartisan consensus. So remember, it was Trump. It was Clinton, a Democrat. And you had Narasimha Rao, and then you had Vajpayee. And then you had Bush, Republican, with all this neocon business and stuff like that. And after Vajpayee, you had Manmohan Singh, and then you had Obama, who was Democrat, and and so on. So we've kind of carried on, as it were, from there, from Obama to Trump, and from Manmohan Singh to Modi. I think that what will happen is that perhaps just as we were able to come to terms with some of the plus things that Trump did, and among the plus things I would say was his very frontal calling out of China, which enabled certain things on the defense and strategic side to move forward between India and the US. We are seeing that, the Indo-Pacific Command and all the rest of it on the maritime side, and and we'll see what happens with regard to the burgeoning sort of defense relationship with the signing of all the foundational agreements on the last one, when it's quite remarkable that you had the Secretary of State
visiting a week before the elections,
Pompeo, accompanied by this Defense Secretary Esper, a week before the elections, coming to Delhi for talks with their Indian counterparts. I mean, and India and Delhi saying, yes, please come. I mean, that is equally important. Now, so obviously it is also a reflection of changing geopolitical realities. So while there were positive things that we were able to use vis-a-vis the actions of the Trump administration, there were also other unpredictable and perhaps not such happy events, like, say, the whole business about Harley Davidson motorcycles and stuff like that. Pointless exam. As you know, I mean, now they've sort of closed shop or whatever it is, or things like that, or on the H-1B visas and things like that. So, obviously, we are not going to get a president, since we are not going to be choosing the US president. We are not going to get a president to our heart's desire. So we will make do with whichever president we get. And so if it is going to be Biden, yes, but then there will be perhaps a greater predictability in terms of the Biden administration. A lot will also depend on who the people are, who Biden puts in key positions like the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, defense secretary, etc., and things like that. And yes, perhaps we can expect a certain amount of discomfort on issues that you mentioned, the CAA, Article 370, human rights. But at the same time, a greater amount of predictability, probably an easing in terms of trade pressures, perhaps an easing in terms of H-1B visas, and at the same time, even climate change. I mean, as you know, Trump walked out of climate change. So, there are pluses and minuses. So we'll deal with whichever administration is in place in Washington.
So talking about predictability, Trump's policies have been the nail in the coffin when it comes to global cooperation, right? He stepped away from the WHO in the middle of a global pandemic. If Biden is the next president, is the task for him going to be really hard to restore America to a place of being a global leader? And when you talk about America's relationships with its adversaries and junior partners, being a global leader that one can rely on, not to bail on agreements, like the climate agreement, Paris, India agreed to it because we expected the US would fulfill its side by investing in renewables, which Trump says, I don't want to pay for this, and he walked out and put the blame on India and China, not just bracketed us with China and threw us under the bus. So is that going to be a huge problem for Biden if re-elected?
Maritime boundaries. So none of this was lost on the Obama administration, except that the Obama administration embarked on two things. They said, first, Obama announced his pivot to Asia, or rebalancing to Asia. So they said, well, Europe, etc., settled, things like that. This was before Putin decided to walk into Crimea and annex Crimea and, things like that. So he said, well, Europe is settled, and we are, of course, US is a Pacific power. And so we are going to be doing a rebalancing to Asia. The second thing that Obama did was he started engaging with what was called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, once again, it was seen as something that was an economic distancing from China by pulling together US and its partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, etc., into an economic alliance. So he was doing it, but at the same time, he didn't want to call out China as an adversary. So what he did was he shifted from what I would say competition with China to a kind of unstated containment of China. Okay? Now, what Trump did was, instead of containment, well, he said, oh, this is all nonsense. I mean, you have power, you must exercise it. So he moved to confrontation. So it became trade war, and that's it. Technology war, and that's it. The first technology controls vis-a-vis China introduced by the US started happening during the Obama administration, except that they oscillated between competition, containment, cooperation. I mean, they kind of limited it to those three C's. Yeah. I mean, Trump shifted it to confrontation, full stop, and that's it. And I will do a deal because I'm the best deal maker. Okay, and that's how it has moved forward. But then it also closes certain channels for communication. It closes certain dialogue areas. And it suited Trump fine because he was withdrawing from multilateral leadership in any case. I mean, he said this is too much of a burden for the US to carry. That wasn't Obama's approach. I mean, Obama wanted to continue with the leadership, but then carry more people carry more countries along with him, which is what he tried to do with the climate change, including China, as well as bringing in India. So, but that kind of a thing didn't suit Trump's agenda, as it were. Biden will certainly try to revive that, because he's very much part of that particular tradition of Democrats. He's also part of, given his long career in the US Senate, I think 6 terms, that's like 36 years. I mean, that's huge. Or 5 terms, 30 years, plus 8 years as vice president. I mean, that's like an enormous length of time in a very, very senior position. And he's held all kinds of chairmanships of various important committees in the Senate. So he's used to kind of reaching out and doing a deal, reaching out across the aisle, doing a deal, and that kind of a thing. So obviously, he will try to revive a US leadership role in the multilateral field. He will certainly, he has said that he would want to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. He'll certainly take the US back into WHO. The idea that WTO, World Trade Organization, was emasculated by the Trump administration, I'm sure he'll try to reverse that. So I'm reasonably certain.
So we may see a global order now based on rules again. Don't know. But everybody's been super interested in this election, so I'm sure there are questions before we run out of time. Anyone?
Not that we need one, but we'll get it nevertheless.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for coming and enjoyed the talk. The last few days, if they have told us anything, is that US is as divided, perhaps if not more, than like India, and perhaps in a much more messier situation. We, India, as such, this is exciting times for India. I mean, apart from the COVID, I shouldn't have used the word, but we are emerging to be a much stronger nation as far as dealing with the things. Consumer confidence is going up. The markets, it's really going up. The businesses have started picking up. At least from my field, I can see that. How we Indians, the Europe is shutting down, India is opening up. How we Indians can start asserting our position and use vaccine, for the choice of better words, arm twist the world. And why not?
Use vaccine?
Arm twist the world.
Which vaccine?
COVID vaccine.
The one we invent.
The one we invent.
We're yet to invent.
All right, okay. I mean, well, okay. Why don't we wait till we invent that? Right now, we are only undertaking tests of vaccines. I mean, we are undertaking tests of one vaccine, the AstraZeneca Oxford group, that's one. I think we are also undertaking tests of the one that the Russians have come up with. And Bharat Biotech is working to develop its own vaccine. So let's see, once we come up with that.
We would be having the largest installed capacity of making the vaccines in the world.
Yes.
So why we can't use that against the world?
Again, I mean...
As an advantage, I guess as an advantage, not...
yeah, okay. I mean, I'm sure we don't want to use it against the world, because I think that, your foreign policy, in a sense, has to reflect your own civilizational ethos. And our foreign policy, therefore, I mean, that's why the term that you said, use it against the world, is something which I would not go with, because it doesn't gel with the way we see ourselves. We don't see ourselves as India against the world. We see ourselves as India assuming its own sort of place of whatever it is, leadership, importance, weight. Yeah.
Soft power.
Soft power, whatever. I mean, so things like that. And I'm quite sure that we will, use it to that effect. There is no two ways about it. But I think and this in a sense also relates to the question that you asked me about the Biden administration. See, a lot of things will also depend on what is our weight as a partner? And how does, let's say, another country judge our weight as a potential partner? How is the Indian economy doing? Now, you said we are doing very well. Okay, I mean, if we are going to be tomorrow a $5 trillion economy by 2023, 2024, whatever it is, and so on. And I mean, it would certainly increase our standing. If we are seen to be a country that can manage its neighborhood, can have good relationship with its neighbors, its neighboring countries, look up to India for help, I mean, our economic footprint increases in our neighborhood, we become a more attractive regional player, a regional partner, and that kind of a thing. So, but if we are seen to be an economy that is kind of nationalistic or not growing, but or growing maybe at an anemic rate, or if we are seen as a country where our neighbors continue taking pot shots at us, or compare us to China. I mean, we are seeing that. We've seen that in Nepal and Bangladesh and et cetera, Sri Lanka and so on. Then clearly people will say, well, hang on. I mean, is India a country whose time has come, as it were? Or maybe, and if we remain preoccupied with more internal issues, CA 370, whatever it is, that takes our, the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir and things like that. Obviously, all of this takes up political bandwidth. And, then people will say, all right, let them sort out their own house, let them put their own house in order before we look at them. We'll see how things turn out. But sure, I mean, you're right. We are the largest vaccine producer in the world. And if we are successful in Bharat Biotech or whichever other Indian group is successful in coming up with a vaccine for COVID, I mean, I'm 100% sure that it will earn us enormous amount of goodwill the world over.
It is a vaccine, it only works as everybody has it. We're only safe if everybody is safe. And India's economy also depends on everybody having a vaccine, right? The world will now be divided on a new front line. Those who have the vaccine, those who don't. Those who have the vaccine will get visas to travel. International trade if it has to resume. So everybody has to have a vaccine for it to work. So we can sit on the vaccine, but it's of no use.
I have two questions, if I may. Just going back to the US elections, what do you think are the cultural underpinnings of this result? I know I asked you this at the bar earlier on, but is it a referendum on COVID, the lack of the blue wave, or, in your opinion, is it like a deeper sort of, Trump has been ramping up rhetoric against, he's been quite divisive with his rhetoric. Do you think that's hit a nerve within a broader US thing? Because I don't think anyone expected him to have such a high, whatever the results may be, such a high return. So what do you think, is there a cultural underpinning that people missed, the pollsters missed, that's hit a nerve?
Well, first of all, I think the pollsters missed, full stop. There is no two ways about that. I think the pollsters really missed, once again, if we want to add that. But it's quite clear that the 230,000 deaths, I don't know what the latest figures in the US of COVID casualties are, but something like of that order, I think. I don't think that actually was a factor in the elections. I mean, I would say even competence. I mean, forget COVID, but if you look at so many other issues vis-a-vis the Trump administration, I mean, competence didn't really seem to be a particular factor for those who have supported Trump. It's interesting.
Almost 70 million people. It's not a,
Well, no, you're right, absolutely. But isn't it interesting that they were obviously motivated and guided by something else? Maybe his communication skills. I mean, after all, he has 50 million Twitter followers. I mean, I'm sure not all the Twitter followers that he has voted for him. I mean, there are many people who just follow him because they want to keep abreast of what he is up to. But nonetheless, but I don't think that COVID obviously was a factor. And it's quite revealing from the point of view of the pollsters, because if you were asking questions about COVID and asking people to rate Trump's performance on handling of COVID, and you were getting some responses and you were tabulating those, then in the final analysis, those were irrelevant. So clearly, the 230,000 deaths don't seem to have been much of a factor in influencing those who were Trump supporters. I think they were guided by other factors other than COVID.
and my sort of follow-up question, which is unrelated, but it's, you know, I've been reading a lot about it. A lot of academics writing about a changing world order and China taking a much, you know, bigger position in that in the coming decades and years. And I think just from, I'd like to get your opinion on India seems to be aligning itself with the US. Are we making a strategic mistake in the medium term? Not short term, but in the medium term? Because, I mean, if you look at the rate, if you read the Ray Dalios of the world or what have you, I mean, they're clearly writing that the next 60, 70 years belongs to China. And are we aligning ourselves in the medium term incorrectly? From a foreign policy perspective, I'd be interested to know.
Well, you know, first of all, I think we need to understand that then policies are not carved out in stone. Policies will obviously change. I mean, I'm sure many of you come from the private sector and you adapt to changing circumstances. I mean, who had foreseen what COVID would do to the world of business and commerce, and how have people adapted to it? So clearly, many of the concepts that you had have had to be redone completely in order to cope with the changing realities. And I think the same is true. Now, you know, but what happens is very often that labels, policies lead to labels and jargon, things like that. And labels then tend to constrain policy because they get their own weight. You take non-alignment as a case in point. I mean, non-alignment was designed by Nehru not as an end in itself. Non-alignment was an approach which was designed with the objective of increasing India's diplomatic space for maneuver. Okay? Because if we had been part of, during the Cold War, if we had been part of Soviet Union-led alliance or US-led alliance, to that extent Nehru felt that it would hamper, it would constrain us. And so it was best as a large country to play a non-aligned role, to adopt non-alignment as a policy. Not as an end goal, as a policy to achieve a certain end goal, to expand our diplomatic space. When non-alignment becomes a movement, which starts happening in the 60s and 70s and so on, and becomes, you know, a lot of ideology. The Cubans take over, the Palestinian issue takes over, and all the rest of it. Now, when it becomes a movement, then it becomes like an ideology. And then we know that it constrains us, because it like holds us back from certain things that we may want to do. So in 1971, when we signed the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty, which was called the Friendship Treaty but is loosely a security treaty, were we really being non-aligned? Not really. We were addressing our own security concerns because US had taken a very partisan view in favoring Pakistan on the whole Bangladesh crisis and so on. And as a result, when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, we were one non-aligned country which sort of refused to condemn the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Were we really being non-aligned when we refused to condemn it? No. We were doing a quid pro quo, right? So I think that we need to understand that sometimes labels assume a certain life. But even today, I mean, you keep talking of non-aligned. Now, okay, there were two countries, two superpowers at that time, US and Soviet Union, and you could say, okay, I want to be non-aligned. So I don't want to be aligned to this fellow, or I don't want to be aligned to this fellow. Now, you come to 1991, Soviet Union disintegrates, etc., etc. You've got US as the only superpower. Now, at that stage, who do you want to be non-aligned from? So if you still keep talking about, no, I am going to be non-aligned. Well, okay. I mean, this is like tilting at windmills.
I guess the only constant is change. Any other questions? Yeah, hold on one second. Nicola, come to you. One question here.
So one hypothetical question, I didn't realize that there have been only 4 single-term presidents in the US. In case Donald Trump loses, right, he will try his best not to give it up. So the Supreme Courts and all coming in. I imagine him winning, and like that old American movie King Kong, the guy thumps his chest, say, I won. And that's what he'll do. But should he lose, I mean, hell will break loose. And if I was imagining R.K. Lakshman drawing a cartoon, where the common man won, what would he draw? Or what would the world see Trump as winning or losing?
Well, I said something earlier about the fact that the US election is, we all have the perception that the US election is something that gets decided in the first week of November when people cast their vote. Actually, it doesn't get decided then. There are lots of other steps that take place, and all of us have now become experts on the Electoral College and, 270 votes in the Electoral College and things like that. But there is also, this part is all part of the US Constitution and the various legislations and so on, that there is an Electoral College, and if the Electoral College meets, and once they produce the result, and then the Congress meets in January, and then it certifies the result, and then on 20th of January, the new administration takes over. Wonderful. However, there is actually something that is neither a part of the US Constitution, nor is it a part of any US Supreme Court judgment, which is actually a very critical part of the US election. And that is the concession speech by the losing candidate. It's a norm. It's a tradition. At a certain point, sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes within 48 hours, And in the old days, when counting used to take much longer, even 3 days or 4 days, the losing candidate would realize that, okay, I'm not going to be able to make it. And his advisors would come to him and would say, look, I think it's time to call it a day. And that's when he would pick up the phone, and or he would go out and make a speech saying, I thank the people who voted for me. I appreciate all the support they've given me. However, the time has come. I now concede the election to whoever is his contender. I wish him success, and I pledge my loyalty to him. I mean, the idea that all his followers, all the people who voted for him, all his supporters, his whole army of people who worked for him would go to bed that night a little disappointed, but not disloyal to the new winner. And then the next morning they would go to their work, to their schools, to their colleges, to whatever, to their shops, to their businesses, to their jobs. Okay? Now, so the concession speech is key. I mean, go back to 2000. I think you were talking about 2000 a little while, the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore, which kind of, you were talking about it just a little while ago. Now, there, you had Gore actually calling Bush on Florida as the counting is going on. Now, he calls Bush and says, I concede. He hasn't, and in the next hour or so, he should go out and normally make his speech. He doesn't do that. He's still waiting. I mean, it normally takes an hour or two because you need to draft that and all the rest of it. That's one speech that no candidate actually prepares, right? You will prepare your victory speech. You won't prepare your concession speech. But then in the next half an hour or so, the counting results start shifting in Florida. So he calls Bush and says, I withdraw my concession offer earlier. Okay? I mean, he hasn't gone public, so he withdraws it. Fine. And the counting goes on. And then, as per the Florida law, there is a machine recount that's ordered because the margin is only 537 votes in Florida, by which Bush is going to be declared winner. And the machine recounting leads to the phenomena of hanging chads. I don't know how many of you remember the phenomena of hanging chads. Does it ring a bell?
Yes.
Yeah? No? You know, they used to have these punch cards. So when you punch, it's supposed to make a clear hole. But if the part that is supposed to fall out doesn't actually fall out but kind of remains stuck, then the term used for that is chad. And so this was the phenomena of hanging chads. As a result of hanging chads which showed up in the machine recount, Gore then asked for manual recount in certain counties, from certain polling counties. As the manual recount is going on, the Bush files a case in the US Supreme Court, saying under Florida election law, there is no provision for manual recount. The US Supreme Court pronounces a judgment upholding Bush's petition, and the recount is stopped. It's just stopped halfway. So the recount is never completed. And at that stage, Gore concedes. He goes public and says, I concede and I pledge my loyalty to George Bush, etc. Okay, race over. Now, in this particular case, Trump has said he's not going to concede.
He's even announced himself the winner.
Well, he's also announced himself the winner. He's also said, I'm not going to concede. So, it's going to be very interesting because, one, you can have a situation, I mean, if you look at it theoretically, none of these, by the way, none of these situations has actually, there's been one case in 1876. In 1876, you had a Republican candidate called Rutherford Hayes, and he was competing with the Democrat called Samuel Tilden. They had a dispute about a certain electoral college number of votes. At that time, the electoral college was smaller. Obviously, it wasn't 538. So 20 electoral votes, there was a dispute. So each side put forward its own slate for those 20 electoral college votes, 1876. So the electoral college could not take a call on who is the winner. So come January, both fellows, Mr. Hayes as well as Mr. Tilden, announced that they would do parallel inaugurations. I'm the President of the United States of America. But then the third stage of the election kicks in, which is in January, on 6th of January, you have the Congress meeting and approving the recommendation of the Electoral College. But there was no recommendation of the Electoral College. Okay? So the Congress met, and now, how the hell do they decide? Legally speaking, there is a provision as to how they decide. And you know what that provision is? That provision is that they just go by the number of states. So the number of states is, say, 50. Each state has one vote. The state is Republican or the state is Democrat. So if 26 states are Republican, 26 Republican, 24 Democrat, Republican candidate wins. Full stop. Doesn't matter, no popular vote, no electoral college, no nothing. They were a little wary of going down that route. So what they did was they set up a Federal Electoral Commission for the first time, 1876. So nearly 100 years after the Constitution had been done in 1787. And they set up this Electoral Commission and included in it all the congressmen, senators, Supreme Court judges, got an acceptance from both the candidates that they would abide by the decision of the Electoral Commission. And the Electoral Commission then decided to give the 20 disputed Electoral College votes to Mr. Rutherford Hayes, full stop. Then Mr. Tilden conceded. But that's where it went. That's 1876. I mean, today's environment is very different from 1876. What with Twitter and social media and Facebook and all the rest of it. So which direction it goes in is anybody's guess. Your guess is as good as mine.
I think, thank you very much for that. I think we don't have any more questions, but I'll end it with this note that I think this, when the voting is counted and the president is elected, whoever the president is, and they have the big procession on the mall, I think this year there'll be less people because of COVID. So Trump can always say he had a bigger crowd in his, genuinely I think he can say he had a bigger crowd in his last thing. But Rakesh, thank you very much for that, I really appreciate it. And Sarah, thanks for coming out. Great, thank you very much.